She seems to me to have such a great head on her shoulders, and she credits you for that.
I'm proud of her.
How much behind the scenes?
You have your mother-daughter relationship.
Hayden Panettiere spent almost her entire life in front of a camera. To millions of viewers, she was the bright, fearless actress who could make a television character feel completely real. From childhood commercials and soap operas to Heroes, Scream, and Nashville, she became a familiar face long before most people her age had decided what they wanted to be. But behind that remarkable career was a life shaped by pressure, complicated family relationships, addiction, grief, and a search for an identity that belonged to her. When Hayden died on August 16, 2026, at only 36, the shock was immediate. Fans remembered her performances, colleagues remembered her talent, and people who had followed her difficult personal journey were left asking how someone who had recently spoken so hopefully about the future could be gone so suddenly. Then her estranged mother, Lesley Vogel, finally spoke publicly. Her words were emotional, painful, and unmistakably complicated. They were not simply the comments of a grieving parent. They were the closing words of a relationship that had been fractured for years. To understand what Vogel said, it is necessary to go back to the beginning, when Hayden was not yet famous enough to understand what fame would demand from her. Lesley Vogel was an actress herself, and she became the person who managed Hayden's career from its earliest days. At only 8 months old, Hayden was signed with Wilhelmina Models. By the age of 4, she was appearing on One Life to Live. At 6, she joined Guiding Light. Before she was even old enough for middle school, she had reportedly appeared in more than 50 commercials and had become an important source of income for her family. From the outside, it looked like a dream. A talented little girl was working in Hollywood, earning money, gaining experience, and building a career that many adults could only imagine. But Hayden later described another side of that childhood. She said she had been groomed for the business and felt like a little soldier. Her job was to memorize the dialogue, hit her marks, follow instructions, and keep moving. That description matters because the pressure did not disappear as Hayden became successful. Instead, the expectations grew with her career. One of the most painful moments between mother and daughter came during Hayden's time on Heroes. By then, she was no longer simply a child actor. She was a major television star, and she wanted a relationship with her mother that was separate from business. During an appearance on the Jay Shetty podcast, Hayden recalled telling Vogel that she did not want them to work together anymore. She wanted her to simply be her mom. According to Hayden's account, Vogel answered with 2 words, "You owe me." Then she walked out of the trailer. For Hayden, that moment became a symbol of everything that had gone wrong between them. A mother and daughter who had spent years working side by side were suddenly separated by the very career they had built together. In her memoir, This Is Me, A Reckoning, Hayden described her mother as a perfectionist and made several deeply personal allegations about her childhood. She recalled an incident in which she said Vogel superglued a loose tooth back into her mouth so she would not miss a job. She also described feeling pressure to dress in more traditionally feminine clothing when she preferred a tomboy style. Vogel later told Page 6 that after years of trauma, she had followed professional advice and chosen no contact. She said no parent wants to watch a child move toward destructive choices and that a person cannot be saved if they do not want help. And the family had already suffered another enormous loss. Hayden's younger brother, Jansen Panettiere, died in 2023 at age 28 from heart complications. Hayden had described him as the other half of her soul. His death came while she was rebuilding her life, and the grief reportedly overwhelmed her. She gained significant weight, developed severe anxiety about leaving home, and struggled to maintain the progress she had made in recovery. Vogel had now lost both of her children. When she spoke after Hayden's death, she said through tears that she believed Hayden was with Jansen and that they were at peace. It was one of the gentlest parts of her statement, especially because so much of the surrounding story involved blame, regret, and unresolved pain. But Hayden's career had been extraordinarily long before the family conflict became public. She became a recognizable television star through Heroes, where she played Claire Bennet, a cheerleader with the ability to regenerate from injuries. Audiences responded to her warmth and emotional honesty, and the character quickly became one of the show's most memorable figures. She later appeared as Kirby Reed in the Scream franchise, but Nashville became the defining role of her adult career. As Juliette Barnes, Hayden played a talented country singer whose fame could not protect her from loneliness, destructive choices, complicated relationships, and emotional collapse across 6 seasons. Looking back, the character seemed almost painfully connected to Hayden's own life. Juliette had success, money, attention, and talent, yet she could not find peace. Hayden brought an unusual emotional honesty to the role because she understood what it meant to live with expectations that never seemed to stop. Nashville ended in 2018 after 6 seasons. Around that same period, Hayden entered one of the darkest chapters of her life. She later described becoming dependent on opioids and alcohol and wanting to do everything she was not supposed to do. Acting had been her entire identity, yet she said she felt so badly about herself that she had stopped trusting herself. The end of Nashville also coincided with painful changes in her personal life, including an arrangement that left her daughter Kaya primarily in the care of Kaya's father, Vladimir Klitschko. Hayden had already experienced years of emotional pressure, and now she was dealing with addiction, separation from her daughter, and the collapse of the professional world that had defined her. Still, she kept trying to rebuild. During the 2026 promotion of her memoir, Hayden spoke openly about feeling that the darkness was finally behind her. She described one door closing and another opening. She said she could see possibilities ahead and believed she still had a great deal of life to live. Those words make her death even more heartbreaking. Because the story of Hayden Panettiere was never simply about fame. It was about what happens when a person grows up inside an industry before they are old enough to decide whether they want that life. It was about a daughter who wanted her mother to become simply her mother, an actress who struggled to separate herself from her characters, and a woman who kept trying to reclaim a future that she felt had once been chosen for her. But the most controversial chapter of that future involved Brian Hickerson, the man her mother believed should never have remained in her life. Hayden met Hickerson through her brother in 2018, shortly after the end of her long relationship with heavyweight boxing champion Vladimir Klitschko. Her engagement had ended, her daughter was living primarily with Klitschko in Ukraine, and the television series that had defined her adult career was approaching its conclusion. What began as a relationship quickly became a source of serious concern. Hickerson was arrested in 2019 on an allegation involving injury to a spouse or girlfriend. In 2021, he pleaded no contest and received a sentence that included jail time and formal probation. Hayden eventually spoke publicly about the abuse. She said she wanted her story to help other people trapped in abusive relationships find the courage to seek support. In her memoir, she described an incident in which Hickerson allegedly beat her so severely that she stayed inside for weeks. She also explained why she had been reluctant to involve police. She feared that the public would discover what was happening. That fear revealed another cruel reality of her life. Even in moments when she was suffering privately, Hayden knew that millions of people were watching her. She later described the relationship as a cycle. They could laugh, dance, and seem completely connected, and then something would change. The warmth would disappear, and violence could take its place. That pattern is one reason abusive relationships can be so difficult to escape. The person experiencing the harm may also be holding onto the moments when the relationship feels safe. By 2026, Hayden had written about that experience with a level of honesty that would have been difficult for her earlier in life. She was trying to make sense of her choices rather than hide them. And yet, shortly before her death, she was still connected to Hickerson. That fact would become central to her mother's statement, leaving painful questions behind. The presence of Brian Hickerson in Hayden's final days would become one of the most painful details surrounding her death. According to reports, Hayden traveled with Hickerson from Los Angeles to South Carolina shortly before August 16, 2026. He and his brother Zach were at the Judson Mill Lofts apartment in Greenville when a friend found Hayden unresponsive that afternoon. Emergency responders arrived to find her in cardiac arrest. Authorities later said that no foul play was suspected, while the cause of death remained under investigation at the time of the source material. Hickerson reportedly showed officers a bag containing medication Hayden had been taking. The police report also noted that he did not become visibly emotional until she was declared dead. For Lesley Vogel, those details were devastating. She had spent years trying to distance Hayden from a relationship she believed was harmful. Now, the person she had wanted removed from her daughter's life was reportedly present when Hayden died. That is why Vogel's statement was more than a mother's expression of grief. It was also the final chapter of a battle she believed she had been fighting for years. Yet the story cannot be reduced to one relationship. Hayden's struggles had roots that stretched much further back, into childhood, fame, family expectations, addiction, motherhood, and grief. Her relationship with Hickerson was a major part of her later pain, but it existed inside a much larger story. The death of her brother Jansen had already changed everything. Jansen was Hayden's only sibling, and she had often spoken about the unique bond they shared. He had worked as an actor himself and appeared in several film and television projects. When he died in February 2023, Hayden described the loss as if half of her soul had disappeared. She had been working toward recovery and rebuilding her life when the tragedy happened. Grief disrupted that progress. She gained around 40 pounds in the weeks afterward, developed agoraphobia, and struggled to leave her home. The woman who had spent her life performing for millions suddenly found ordinary life outside her house frightening. Her recovery became a slow process rather than a dramatic transformation. She began taking long walks. She returned to routines. She tried to create structure when grief had taken almost everything else away. She also continued remembering Jansen publicly, marking birthdays and anniversaries that reminded her and her fans that the loss had never truly disappeared. That grief also helps explain the emotional weight of her mother's final words. Lesley Vogel had lost her son in 2023. 3 years later, she lost her daughter. When she said that Hayden was now with Jansen and that the two were at peace, she was not simply offering a statement about death. She was trying to imagine a place where the two children she could no longer protect were together again. But there was another unresolved wound between Vogel and Hayden. This Is Me, A Reckoning was published in May 2026, just months before Hayden died. The memoir became an important part of the final public chapter of her life because she used it to describe experiences that had remained private for years. Hayden portrayed her childhood as intensely controlled. She wrote about feeling groomed for the entertainment business and described an upbringing where obedience and performance were expected. She also explained the emotional consequences of being treated like a professional long before she had the freedom to understand what that meant. Vogel did not accept that version without response. She said she had experienced 20 years of trauma and that professionals had advised her to maintain no contact. From her perspective, stepping away was not an act of cruelty. It was a decision made after years of trying to survive an increasingly painful relationship. That created two sharply different versions of the same family history. Hayden believed the door to reconciliation remained open. She said she had not abandoned hope of repairing the relationship and felt that her mother had chosen to close that door. Vogel believed distance was necessary. Neither side reached the ending they wanted. And that may be the most heartbreaking part of the entire story. There was no final private conversation that healed everything. There was no reunion in which mother and daughter finally understood each other. There was no chance to rewrite the past. Instead, their unresolved relationship became part of the public record through interviews, a memoir, and statements released after Hayden's death. Hayden's father, Skip Panettiere, responded differently. He described his daughter as an incredible light and a force of nature who brought enormous love and joy to people who knew her and to the millions who watched her work. His statement focused on what Hayden gave to the world. Vogel's statement carried something more complicated. It included love, regret, concern, and a clear belief that some of the choices surrounding Hayden's final years had contributed to her suffering. She said Hayden had many incredible qualities. She said she wished things had been different. She wished Hayden had stayed true to herself. And through tears, she returned to the thought that Hayden and Jansen were now together and at peace. Those words cannot repair a broken relationship, but they reveal something important. Even after years of distance, even after painful accusations and opposing memories, Vogel was still speaking about her daughter with love. That contradiction is what makes the story so difficult to simplify. Her career is a major part of that legacy. Juliette Barnes was complicated because Hayden was capable of making complicated characters feel human. But extraordinary success does not automatically create an extraordinary life. Sometimes it creates pressure. Sometimes it creates isolation. And sometimes the person everyone thinks they know is fighting a completely different battle away from the cameras. Hayden spent years trying to explain that difference. In interviews surrounding her memoir, she sounded hopeful. She spoke about leaving darkness behind. She talked about possibilities and about believing she still had more life ahead of her. That makes her death feel especially cruel. Her story was supposed to be moving forward. Instead, it ended suddenly. And now the world is left with the complicated responsibility of remembering her accurately. Not as a headline. Not only as a tragedy. Not simply as the actress who played Juliette Barnes or Claire Bennet. And not merely as the woman whose private struggles became public. She deserves to be remembered as someone who had extraordinary talent and who kept trying, even when the path became painfully difficult. They also remind us that recovery is rarely a straight line. A person can be sober and still be grieving. A person can understand abuse and still struggle to leave the emotional patterns created by it. A person can recognize family pain and still hope for reconciliation. Someone can look hopeful in an interview while carrying private wounds that other people cannot see. That complexity was Hayden Panettiere. Her mother's final statement cannot tell the whole story because no single statement could. Hayden herself tried to tell more of it through her memoir. Her father remembered her light. Her fans remember the performances. Her family remembers the daughter and sister behind the fame. And somewhere between all those perspectives is a fuller picture of a woman who spent her life being seen while still struggling to feel truly understood. Perhaps that is the legacy worth protecting. Hayden Panettiere's life was not defined by the final headlines. It was defined by decades of work, by characters that became meaningful to audiences, by the courage to speak honestly about painful experiences, and by the effort to rebuild after devastating setbacks. She was 36 when her life ended, but the story she left behind is much larger than that number. Lesley Vogel's words were heartbreaking because they came after there was no longer any chance to change what had happened. Her daughter was gone. Her son was already gone. The years of distance could not be recovered. So she spoke to the world instead. She spoke about regret. She spoke about danger. She spoke about her daughter's qualities. And finally, she spoke about peace. Maybe that is where this story should end. Not with the arguments. Not with the allegations. Not with the mistakes. But with the human being underneath them. She did not get the peaceful ending she hoped for. But she did leave behind a record of honesty. And perhaps that is the most meaningful way to remember her. Not as someone who simply lost her way, but as someone who spent years trying to find her way back. Her talent was real. Her struggles were real. Her love for her family was real. And so was the hope she expressed shortly before her death. For the millions who watched Hayden Panettiere grow up on screen, her passing is a reminder that the person behind a famous face is always more complicated than the role we remember. Her legacy should therefore hold the entire picture. The child actress, the television star, the singer on Nashville, the sister, the mother, the survivor, the daughter, and the woman who wanted another chance at life. That is the Hayden Panettiere worth remembering. Not only the tragedy, the talent, not only the controversy, the courage, and not only the final chapter. The whole story. Her voice, work, and story will continue to matter for years ahead.